So now we are live.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. I would like to check whether you can hear me and see me well. Yes, do you hear me and see us well? Yes, I would like to check with you, please, before we start this webinar, this interesting webinar with Professor Theo Van Leeuwen. Hello, yes, thank you. Yes, we can. Thank you very much for your feedback. Thank you. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen from Morocco, or maybe good afternoon or good evening from Australia, wherever you might be in this world. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar. It is my privilege now to extend to you a warm welcome on behalf of Sidi Mohammed bin Abdullah University in Fez, Morocco. I am very, very happy and honored to welcome and introduce our special guest today, Professor Theo Van Leeuwen, who is going to talk about an interesting topic that is of social semiotics and discourse analysis, and of course other related issues. So before the webinar begins, allow me please to introduce our distinguished guest. Professor Theo Van Leeuwen is a linguist and social semiotician, widely recognized as a co-founder of Multi-Modality and one of the main developers of social semiotics. Before becoming an academic, Professor Theo Van Leeuwen worked as a film and television producer, script writer, and director in his native Netherlands and in Australia. Professor Van Leeuwen has published widely on multimodality, social semiotics, and critical discourse analysis. He wrote with Gander Press, Reading Images, the Grammar of Visual Design, which is considered one of the most influential books on the topic. Among his recent books are Introducing Social Semiotics in 2005, Discourse and Social Practice, New Tools for Critical Discourse Analysis in 2008, and The Language of Color in 2011. In 1991, he co-founded the journal Social Semiotics and is a founding co-auditor of the journal Visual Communication, established in 2001. He is also on the editorial boards of several other international peer-reviewed journals that provide publication platforms for research and on multimodality and critical discourse analysis. So please give a warm welcome to our distinguished guest, Professor Theo Van Leeuwen, who is going to talk about this interesting topic. Thank you, Professor, for joining us and accepting the invitation to be here with us. Thank you very much. Yes,
thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. First of all, Professor, since the webinar's topic is about social semiotics and discourse analysis, I would like to start by asking you to give us some brief definitions of social semiotics and discourse analysis. In other words, what is the main focus of social semiotics and discourse analysis? The floor is yours, Professor.
Well, we'll take them one by one. Let's start with social semiotics. And so what I usually want to say is that I see social semiotics, I don't want to say what it is, I want to say what you do. I want to see it as a practice, an activity, something that social semioticians do. And there are then three things that are involved. The first one is what we do as social semioticians. We study semiotic resources. We study the things that people use to communicate. which can be all sorts of things. That's multimodal. It can be language, but it can also be gestures. It can also be images and so on. We study those, how they, try to make a systematic study the way in which they make meanings, but also want to study how they how they come about over history and how they develop. For example, in reading images, that is what we do. To a large degree, in reading images, we have laid out a systematic account of the resources that people use when they make images. One example of that, for example, is the gaze, the look. So in a picture, somebody in a picture, and sometimes also animals or things, if they have eyes, they can look at you, or they cannot. If I'm not going to look at you now, and I keep talking like this, you're going to be a little bit disturbed. But some pictures, people look at you, some pictures don't. And that has a history. That has a history at a certain point, when sort of in the Renaissance in Western Europe, sort of individuality became more important. Suddenly you could see important people in the community looking at you from pictures by Rembrandt and so on. And this idea of the gaze was first established, and then it became a common resource for people to use whenever they make pictures with people in it or other things. Second thing we study, how are these resources actually used? How are they used in specific context? How are they used in specific context, and how is that use organized by people? How do they teach the use of it? How do they arrange it? Have they got rules, or are they additions and unspoken rules? And how are these uses of this resource actually talked about? And so there we go to a different dimension. And when we say again about the gaze, we can, for example, see now I'm looking at you, but it is very common if we've done this on traditional television, Nabil would look at you, but I would not, because it's then the anchor people and the journalists look at the viewer, but you, as a guest, or you cannot look into the camera. That's wrong. You cannot directly address the audience. That's a rule that is a tacit rule, but it's also a rule that I learned very early on when I went to film school in Amsterdam. That's a particular, but in other contexts, there might again be different kinds of rules about it. So then and sometimes there are no rules, there are just role models. So that's what we study. And thirdly, we also want to study how can the semiotic resources and the ways of using them, how can they be changed, and how are they changed? So, for example, now when we get new technologies, these practices and these ways of using resources are changing, not the same as what they have been, And we get new kinds of uses of the look at the camera. For example, in selfies, that are different from traditional self-portraits or art or television. So those three things, studying the resources, the languages that are used in communication, studying the way they are actually used in specific contexts, and studying also and hopefully participating in changing these kind of things. So we're very keen now on study how new semiotic technologies, affect how these resources are being used. And the context, when we talk about social semiotics, it's actually the context, the emphasis on context that makes social semiotics different from other kinds of semiotics. In other kinds of semiotics, people often talk, for example, about how is the signified, the meaning related to the signifier, the image or the word or the sound that puts it across, that is audible or visible. We focus very much on the context, and we don't say what does this mean, but what we want to say is what do people make it mean, and how do they organize that, And how do they learn that? And how do they critique it? And so on. People who make meanings. And so we study that in kind of contexts. And of course, the same semiotic resources can mean very different things in different contexts. That's, for example, what is very interesting about color. The color red means different things in different contexts. It can mean danger or it can mean passion. The color green also means very, very different things in different contexts. It's a sacred color in Islam, but it is also the color of green eco movements. Depending on the context, it doesn't quite mean the same thing. But that is very, very important to take into account. About color, you still can often find on the internet lists that say color red means that, green means that. I say to my students, no, don't use those lists because they are decontextualized. You have to study this in the context. So that's just a little thing about what I think doing social semiotics is. And now we come to, you asked me also about discourse. And discourse is actually a little bit of a problematic word sometimes because it has two kinds of meanings that are both very widely used. And you've got to keep them separate. On the one hand, discourse is used by many linguists, for a level of language. So they say, okay, you have the level of sounds of speech, phonology, and then you have the rules that put sounds together into words. You have the level where words are put together into sentences, and then you have the level where sentences are put together into texts. And that is of discourse. When they speak about discourse rules or discourse semantics, we talk about that's what we talk about. And now the other meaning is quite different. I actually hear a bit of feedback at the moment. Is that preventable? Because I hear myself in echo. That's better. Thank you. Quite good. So the other meaning of the word discourse is different. It is it refers to a certain way of talking about, a certain way of understanding and representing, and not only talking about, but also visualizing and so on, a particular aspect of the world, what is going on in the world. So, for example, and that means that you could have different discourses, different ways of understanding and talking about the same thing. For example, in my book, Using Social Semiotics, I give the example of discourses of war. And because with my colleague David Machin, we have written about how wars are represented. So you've got discourses of war, which are all about small groups of very skilled professional commandos who go in to fix something, to rescue a hostage or do something like that. And you've got discourses of war that are more about patriotic soldiers defending the country, sacrificing themselves for the country, and so on. And these different discourses can be used in different kinds of texts. You can find the discourse of the commando troops, in news reports about, actions against terrorists, but you can also find them in computer games or in novels, and you can find them in films. You can find them in different media, and they can be represented, these discourses, with different means. And the same thing, that is one quite different meaning of the word discourse. That is one that is very important in critical discourse analysis. Because in critical discourse analysis, we want to understand, how these discourses actually do, and how they very often represent certain values, and and how they may seek to instill these values, in people through the uses of language and other communicative modes. So there are the discourse of war that involves these professional commando troops, is one that often has sort of the values of skills, professionalism, looking after each other, and so on. Whereas the discourse of war as patriotic defense of the nation, has values like sacrifice and courage, and so on. And of course, in critical discourse analysis, we want to evaluate those discourses. We want to say whether they are, whether they represent the world, in a way that is productive for peace and for equality, or in a way that can be repressive, and so on. So that is why that second, of course, we do also then discourse analysis in the first meaning of the word, because we're analyzing text, but we also are doing discourse analysis with the second meaning of the word, because we want to know how are things represented. For example, one very important part of critical discourse analysis is how are people represented. And I've written about that, worked on a way of analyzing that in text that relates to how, that can relate to discrimination, to racism, and to sexism, and to all sorts of, oppressive kind of discourse. Then we analyze how these, analyze that in particular kinds of text. And that's become very important. And if you look at journals like Discourse in Society or Critical Discourse Studies, you can see that people do that all over the world and get very involved. And because often they are issues, political or issues and social issues that are very important to them. And with critical discourse analysis, gain a better understanding of it. And so that's become a very important form of discourse analysis, particularly over the last 30 years or so.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for the clarification. Please, since you talked about social semiotics and discourse analysis, can we talk about developing a new theory which combine social semiotics and critical discourse analysis at the same time?
Yes, of course, you can do that, because I think that social semiotics, in the way that I've explained it, allows to do exactly that kind, provides means for doing that kind of discourse analysis. So if you want, for example, to let me try and give an example. If you see, for instance, that in advertisements, we've often studied things like how are men and women, represented in advertisement visually, and then we find several patterns. But one of them is the man is doing something, maybe they're camping and he's making a fire, and the woman looks at him admiringly. So the man is in the center, and the woman is, or the man is, she is walking on like a child on a wall, and he holds her hand. All sorts of, you can see those patterns, and then you can find a particular kind of roles, particular kind of ways that men and women are represented. And that's also been studied very beautifully many years ago by the great American sociologist Irving Goffman in his book Gender Advertisements, that there are certain ways of representing that you may wish to criticize in the name of greater equality. The same would apply to people, not men and women, but to people of different races, ethnicities, religions, and so on. You can use social semiotic forms of analysis to analyze these problems that are fundamental in critical discourse analysis. That's often been done. So in reading images, we have many examples of that kind, and we are, for example, very interested in how our Australian Aboriginal people represent in school books. How do the children in Australia learn in school books about Aboriginal people that are that are also Australians, but that are often far away, and many children grow up in the cities and hardly ever meet Aboriginal people. So then we found patterns in these schools. We found that they're often shown from a very big distance, like as it were on the other side of the street, very small. And whereas other people, for example, immigrants from other countries, they were not shown in so small. So again, you find a pattern of representation that literally and figuratively at the same time distances these people, even though they are co-citizens of your own country, just because they are different. But that's one of the ways that we use social semiotics. We've done things like that throughout, given examples like that throughout the book Reading Images to try and suggest, yes, you can use social semiotic. So often now it's called multimodal critical discourse analysis. Critical discourse analysis, which looks not just at language, but also at other modes, and that has traditionally not been very big in critical discourse analysis. Most people only analyze the language, but more recently, everybody begins to see how important that is. That such things as racism or or Islamophobia and so on are not only represented in language, but also visually and indeed through other kind of modes. So people are beginning to pay more attention to that kind of thing, and there are beginning to be some books. And when we go to critical discourse conferences, we can see more people now talking about it and wanting to study it. And the social semiotic forms of analysis are useful to do that.
Okay, interesting. Professor, before we move on to talk about concrete examples that the multimodality actually have received many questions.
Yes.
I would like, yes, since you talked about context, do you think that the analyst should be or should do an ethnographic work to know about the context?
Yes. I know that. I think we live in a time where multimodality, where multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity is also very important. And there are just certain questions about the texts. I still think you can start with the text. The text will, will create questions in your mind that you can't necessarily answer, without going a step further and doing analysis. So, for example, with my colleague Emilia Donov, we did a project on PowerPoint. And so we started with the results, of course. What is PowerPoint? What can you do with it? But then we had texts. We recorded people's PowerPoint sessions. But then there came questions. The questions are also important. How did you learn it? Why did you, how there are patterns here, but how do they come about? And how has it changed when you started using it? How you do your lectures or your company presentations or whatever. There are certain, and then you can see, for example, that for some people, the how question is because at work they get strict rules about how to do that PowerPoint. There are company presentations. They have to have a company banner above it, and they have to go about it in certain ways. Whereas other people have greater freedom. For example, we recorded lectures on cultural studies at university, and they did at universities, and they did not have so many rules. So they often picked up ideas. They saw somebody's PowerPoint and said, "Oh, that's nice," Or they saw a TED talk with beautiful slides, and so they built up more creatively their own repertoire of how they did it. And of course, so those kind of questions, you need ethnographic research.
Yeah. So how to analyze, for example, or to do or to use social semiotics to read the phenomenon, for example, on a social media that is, for example, of immigrants, especially when we have multiple contexts. So how are you going to analyze such?
Well, I mean, so yes, that is the social media texts, have their own issues, and so what I think is that people have focused, in part because it's easy. We can now get a lot of data from social media, quite easily. We only have to sit at home and collect them. But I think you also got to go out, and you also got to see, you got to ask these questions, who does it and how is it organized? And you got to see that people still do that, however much it's virtual, in the real world, and so how social media, exactly the same questions arise but differently, that I just said with PowerPoint. Is this, for example, we want to know, is this completely spontaneous, or is there an advertising agency behind it who has paying young people to put certain kinds of messages on, Only by doing more research than just looking at what's actually there can we answer those kind of questions, which are very, very important for critical discourse analysis. Because the social media are at once a great advantage, where people can share things, and but at the same time they're being used by powerful organizations and in the world. So critical attention of that kind is actually very important for critical discourse analysis. And unfortunately, the two don't always come together. So you have people who write excellent exposés of how data are used by the big companies, but they don't look at what's actually going on the internet. And you have people that look at what's going on the internet and don't put it in the context. And there, the idea of context is really important, because following Michael Halliday, and others, the context always has two aspects to it. The one is the immediate context, who is doing it. And that's the kind of context I talked about when I talked about PowerPoint. Who has this particular, what is this? Is it in a company? And what are the rules in the company? And who gets to do the, how are people trained to do it or not? The other is the broader social context. PowerPoint is also, for example, to come back one more time about that example, but we could also talk about social media. PowerPoint, originally started, as a way for the people who worked in the Bell laboratories to pitch ideas for funding to their managers. But they put together different means that were before separate into one thing. And ever since then, it has a format, that is pitching things with a few precise points. That's what you have to do when you pitch an idea. But now it's used for so many other things, for lectures. And is that format, you might ask, always the best format for a lecture? Is it always possible? Famous writer on visual image, Edward Tufte, written a little book about PowerPoint, which he calls the cognitive style of PowerPoint. And, so he has seen that there is also a broader context of that whole medium, how it came about, and what it means in society, and how it has changed so many different ways of communicating, including lectures and corporate presentations, and how there is also a certain amount of debate about it.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Professor. Since you mentioned Halliday, we know that Halliday played an important role in the development of multimodality. Could you please talk about the influence of Hallidayan approach to language on your theoretical background, and how you extended this linguistic theory semiotics. So I mean the representational, the interactive, and the compositional meta functions.
So that, well, so in the 1980s, you know, both Gunter Kress and myself worked in Sydney, where I now am again, although I've been away from it for quite a while. So Halliday was an important presence in Sydney, and we had both. I was doing my PhD before at Halliday's faculty, although he was not my supervisor because he had already a lot of students, and Jim Martin was my supervisor. But it was in that context that some of us began to talk, you know, about extending Halliday's ideas into other modes of communication. And when Gunter Kress and I started to work together, we both wanted to do stuff on visual communication. And we thought, okay, what does exist here? Because I always had that as a little bit of a dream, you know, already having worked in visual media, you know, to want to talk between inverted commas about the language of the media. Gunter had written about media text and said, you can't these days talk about it anymore without taking images into account. It's so important. So what are we going to do? And then we thought, well, the way that images are mostly talked about is to talk about the meanings, the literal meanings or the symbolic meanings of the individual people and things in images. You read how iconographers, your art historians write about art, or you had the French semioticians who wrote about connotations of things that are in images. But we thought that what they don't talk about is how it is all brought together in the composition. And then we thought, okay, that's analogous to how words are brought together through grammar. So is there something like a grammar of images? You know? And to do that, we could look at Halliday's theory because previous theories had made the comparison in language too literal. They would have said, is there an equivalent in images of words? No, there isn't. No. Is there an equivalent in images of subject and predicate? No, there isn't. So images completely different. Halliday had a very functional approach to grammar. You know, for him, you analyze a sentence, you know, in terms of an actor, something or someone who does something, for example, and then the process, which is what this person or thing does, and then possibly the goal, which is what that doing is done to. So if I say, you know, we had many Aboriginal examples. You know, the English invaded Australia, and the English is the actor, and invade is the process, and Australia is the goal. And then we say, okay, you know, we can have that in images too, but we don't need to have equivalents of words or clauses, because we then used another theory from Rudolf Arnheim, you know, who said in images you have volume, things, and vectors are the lines. Now you can put up, if you like, that image that I sent to you, and then I'll show you how that works. That first image, can you put? Yeah, then I'll show you how that works. Now. Yeah, you can do that.
Let's move on.
And when we've used that, we can put it back. Have you got it? Can you put it?
Yeah, I have it. Okay. So now, the first one.
Yes, please. So that everybody can see. Everybody can see an example.
Yeah, this is an interesting example because it's practical, and this is helpful for everyone who wants to know how to go through the analysis of visual design and image. Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much. Okay. Yes, you can see now.
You can make it a little bit bigger, perhaps. The actual image. People... Thank you. Okay, so what are, you know, we then asked in this image the volumes. The volumes are parts of image that have a certain weight and a certain size. So here there are clearly two participants, two main volumes. And one, in this picture, I'll just have to explain to you first the context. It's, of course, made for use in newspapers. It's a press photo. And it was made in 1968 in Prague, when there was an uprising that subsequently was quashed by the Russian military in Czechoslovakia. And as so often is the case, the rebellion, the uprising, students played a very important role in it. So here we have two. We have an actor, he then said, a student, and we have a process challenging, or whatever it is, defying, challenging, and we have the goal, which is those Russian soldiers on the right. And the actor is, and the Russian soldiers are the main volumes, the main, if you wanted to reduce this picture to just an outline, that's what you would have be left with. These days you can even do that automatically with various processes. And the process, what in language would be a verb, is that gesture. And that gesture creates a vector. A vector is another word from Arnhem, it is a line that connects two volumes, in this case. And the line can be formed like here, through a gesture or something, but it can also be an arrow in a diagram. Anything that has a sense of direction and that can go in a certain direction, that can therefore also connect an actor, the student who does something, to the Russian soldiers. But of course, the picture is interesting because that's definitely the main factor, the main thing that happens. But there are some other vectors too. There is also the eye line of that soldier who looks a bit sullen, looking at the student. And there are the lines from the trees and the overhead electricity from the tram or the trolley bus. I don't know what it would have been. And these lines, this line, goes from this, is less salient, less big, but the eye line is nevertheless important. Threatening. It is, foreboding something that's yet to come. And the other lines are going into the distance, and in the distance you see smoke and stuff. So the whole picture makes a complex story that you don't even need words for about what is going on. And now, what could be the case, it could have been different. You might remember, I could have put that as well, another famous picture from an uprising by students and others in China, the Tiananmen Square, that famous picture where there's a big tank and a man standing in front of the tank. There, the vector is the huge tank. It's sort of the barrel of the gun is the line that connects soldiers to the student. So there, the actor is different and the goal is different, and the situation is represented differently. That's one example of analyzing, analyzing images using the functional elements, some of the functional elements from Halliday, namely actor, process, and goal, with which he analyzes clauses in language, and to apply it and saying, look, we have actor, process, and goal, but they are made visible, manifested by typical visual things, by volumes and vectors. These ideas of volumes and vectors didn't get from Halliday, we got from the great art theoretician Rudolf Arnhem. Now, this particular structure, this particular composition, that is a transitive composition connecting the student to the scholar, is only one of the many compositional structures that we describe in reading images. But perhaps it can give you an idea of generally how we adapted, how we merged the functional grammatical idea, lexico-grammatical ideas of Halliday with ideas that come from the study of images. Ideas like vectors and volumes, perspective, and framing, and so on and so on.
Okay.
So we can go back to yes.
Yes.
And that was just an example which I think hopefully made it a little bit clear.
Thank you very much. So do you think that the image makers are aware of what ideologies and messages they want to convey and transmit? Are they specialized in social semiotics and communication and the way how to affect the audience? So and who are supposed to read images using social semiotic approaches? Also, can we talk about visual design literacy?
Yes, we can. We can certainly do that. And let's start with the audience. It's certainly the case that images, instead of being read over time, make an immediate impression. And I believe that nobody can miss, who sees this photo, which has become iconic, as they say, very famous. The photographer Joseph Kudelka is now very famous, and his work is in the famous Magnum photo gallery and so on. So people will, I believe, recognize that gesture and those looks, because for that you don't have to any special knowledge. We know what how gestures mean, because we are involved in non-verbal communication all the time. So many of these things are almost like the writing of what we often call non-verbal communication, the writing of gestures, of how we keep distance from each other, of facial expressions and so on. These, I think, most people can read. And the photographer, of course, has been there and has made probably many photos, on the spur of the moment while it was happening, but he has recognized at a certain point this picture said something. Now, whether or not he has put it into words is another question that we don't always know, that we can investigate. In this case, I haven't actually investigated, but when my colleague David Mason and I studied the images that you can now get for money from the Getty Image Bank, which many people do, that go online and you can put in a word and you can say rebellion and you get 1,700 pictures of rebellion. Or you can put in the word freedom and you got 1,800 pictures of freedom. And you can choose and pick for your publication. So we did contact the photographers, and in that case, and they did know what they were doing because they were told by Getty Images what to do, what kind of images wanted. They were very aware of that. So whether that is, I think that with pet photographers of the era and tradition of Belka, of this era, they would not always reason about it. They would just see it, that this was meaningful, and they wouldn't necessarily be asked about it. But that is, again, exactly what you need to ascertain through ethnographic research. Photo can't tell it to you. Now, the audience, there are other things, however, in images that you can ask, do audiences know it? If you do a critical discourse analysis of racism in images, then first of all, you can find that, whereas people are often now a little bit more careful with what they say or what they write, but in images you can still find very traditional colonial heritage type images in advertisements, in tourist brochures, and so on. Now, whether people actually realize that, they probably don't. They will recognize it. And John Berger, the great author of Ways of Seeing, once said, people do recognize it, but he said, like, they don't understand it, but it is reminiscent to them of, this is his quote, cultural lessons half learned, and I often do that with students. I said, look, okay, but where have you seen this before? And they go, no. And I keep on insisting, and then they suddenly say, oh, maybe this or maybe that. And this knowledge has to be unearthed, it has to be dug from memory. And so I feel that as semioticians, that's one thing we need to do. We need to make these things in order to be able to understand those images. We can't just say, images, as people sometimes do, is just whatever you read it in. It's in the eye of the beholder. No, it has traditions, and you can prove, by in various ways that is actually that is an established resource, is an established, in this case, racist or colonial, heritage. And then you have to make people aware of it by whatever means you can. There can be different means, showing how many other pictures of that kind there are and where they come from, for example, that seems to be part of visual literacy as well, to be able to, visual literacy, to be able to read how this image connects the things it shows, which we've just seen an example of. But it is also to be able to get the cultural references that there often are in images.
Interesting. So we can say that for example, political actors, politicians are aware of the way they portray themselves.
Well, they certainly are aware of the way they want to be portrayed and the way they portray themselves. That's why they often make, photo opportunities, being photographed with a helmet on in a factory as the workers, or as a child, or mingling on the people and so on. And of course, these photo opportunities, the photographer may not have much choice there. They just have that particular scene, and they have to photograph it more or less as it is. And the politicians then are quite aware, and their advisors, they have advisors, that tell them what to wear, and that think of these opportunities, and that have probably worked in advertising, but now work for governments. So all of that, there are things behind it. So we can read it, we can see what it means, but we can also study ethnographically how it comes about, and on a small term that is asking that particular photographer, but in a big way it is learning how these image banks like Getty have become places where, as they say themselves, they make a new language of the image for the world.
So what about those who portray themselves on social media, for example, Facebook or Instagram? They are not aware. They are not semioticians. They don't know how to communicate such thing, but they do it, and they try to attract the audience. Maybe this will lead us to talk about the psychology of people.
No, not necessarily the psychology. The psychology is part of it, but in my book, Introducing Social Semiotics, I have a chapter where I try to explain how how things come to be the way they are in different ways. So we can see that people certainly who make these photographs that they post, are not necessarily aware of any rules. They're not told. There's nothing behind it. It's spontaneous, but they have seen things. There are role models for it, things they follow. So then very often what they do, that may be conscious or unconscious, but sometimes it's very conscious. They will have seen something and say, "Oh, that's really nice. That's really cool. I want to try that as well." And so if you ask them questions, as we have done, for example, in the example of PowerPoint that I mentioned, then you find out that there are no rules. They're not told. They have no specific worked out intentions, but they have picked up ideas. And if you ask questions, then they can sometimes find where they picked it up from, and how they came to the point that they could say, "This is how I want to be seen in this photo." this, you know. And so obviously, you know, phenomena like memes are a good example, you know. You can put on a meme and there's no rule to it, and it's actually very creative, you know, but at the same time, meme is a phenomenon, you know, that exists, that's come into being, and that most people who put that, you know, follow a pattern within which they can then be quite creative and doing quite fun things. So there is a context there as well, but of a different kind. And so I say, what we want to know is how come that these things are the way they are? How come that these patterns or these messages exist? We study how that works, how people, as I said earlier on, make meanings and how they come to do so. Have they learned it at school or have they picked it up from friends? You know, all is possible. You know.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. Professor, there is a considerable debate that as to whether multimodality can truly be considered a theory or whether it is more appropriate to view it as a method. So what do you think? Is it a theory or a method?
That's a very good question. And, you know, I would say that, you know, it is difficult to answer because on the one hand, first of all, I think multimodality refers to neither, not to a theory and not to a message, but it refers to a phenomenon in the world that the messages, texts are multimodal, that they use different means of expression, that when we speak, we use words, we use gestures, we use facial expressions, the way we present ourselves, the background here, you know, it all matters. It's a multimodal thing that you are listening to now, you know, and looking at now. And so that's the phenomenon. And that phenomenon is studied now because it's very important now in the age of the internet, you know, more than ever. And everybody can do it. And everybody uses resources where you can use all these different modes, you know, and PowerPoint or Word or the internet. So it's very important phenomenon, but it's studied in different ways. So there are, for example, and there are different terms in the academic world to refer to the same thing. Some people say multimedia. Some people say multisensoriality. That's mostly historians. So multimodality, although that word started in the psychology of perception in the 1920s, now a word that is used for people who study that phenomenon from a semiotic linguistic way. I think that a lot of the work that is done in multimodality is very much mainly applying methods to fantastic examples, and that there is a bit of a paucity of theoretical work. You know, that we have to have that it's just as important to talk about the social semiotic underpinnings, theoretical underpinnings, that cliche word, you know, of these multimodal methodologies. That's very, very important. And not to do that in a limited way, but to do that in an open way, to look to realize that other people study these phenomena too. You know, that we might even be able to connect to that and learn something from it. So I think to say it is theory or it is a message, I think what I have to say is, again, what people do under the heading of multimodality is today often mainly taking methodologies, you know, and applying it. But and that's actually another point that Michael Halliday always said: good applied work changes the theory. You know, you can never have a strict, complete strict separation between you and every time you study something new, you're going to possibly, it hasn't been studied, new kind of data. You might have to adjust the methods to what you want to do. That's the thing I'm worried about sometimes. I think that sometimes people don't understand it. They don't have the freedom to that, you know, which they should have, and that they just think all the answers should be there. Is it this or is it that? What Van Leeuwen and Kress say, or whatever, you know. And sometimes, you know, it is either. So one person, just the other day, I read a very nice PhD thesis that I had to examine, and it was about multimodal texts in India that were made during the time that there was a war that eventually led to the start of Bangladesh. And so she said, your theory, she didn't say your theory, she used my social actor theory, but she disagreed with the fact that I'd said that, there is this difference between categorizing people in terms of certain categories and naming people, because naming, I had said, just their individual identities. He said, no, in India, that's not the case. In India, from the surnames, straight away whether somebody is Hindu or Muslim in most cases. So it led to categorize it. So that was good. She changed, although in a small way, she changed the method because she had different data. And everybody should be aware, that has to be done. And that, that by doing that, you develop both theory and the methods.
Okay, thank you. So, Professor, we know that one of the key terms in multimodality is the term mode.
Yes.
Okay, so what is a mode and how many modes do we have? And what is the difference between semiotic resources and modes?
Okay, well, there's one difficult question again. Why? Because people have, if you read that is now one point of theory in multimodality that is being discussed, and where, for example, ideas have been put forward that are a bit different in recent years by John Bateman, by Günter Kress, and by myself, where Günter has also gone in a slightly different direction than he originally was in. So very much debated. Sometimes people just say modes. Modes is just all the things you use when you communicate, gestures, speech. But I had a different thought, which is just one of the ways of looking at it, that you have to distinguish between modes and media, because you have abstract resources and concrete resources. Abstract resources, which is, for example, the knowledge of how to build a sentence, a correct grammatical sentence, or how to write a story in a certain way. That is abstract knowledge, and that gets realized in different ways. The story can become a movie or written or spoken. The sentence can be written or spoken. So you have different media in which these modes are being realized. Modes to me are abstract knowledges that are a resource. You need to use that knowledge to make a text that can be used, that can be realized in different concrete media. But these media themselves add something too, it's not exactly the same story once it's done in a film, because, for example, the actor, the actors in the film, they will add important meanings to what was originally designed in the narrative through their facial expression and their multimodal resources are very concrete, bodily. So I make this distinction. And then I also think that sometimes people call other things mode, like dress or architecture. And I say, no, they're not modes, they are practices that use semiotic resources. For example, architecture use color, it use shape, and so on and so on. And it also has its own abstract design systems. So I think resources is the overarching category. Then you've got two kinds of resources, modes and media. And the modes are the more abstract resources, are basically in your mind that you have learned, and the others, the media are the concrete things that make it visible, audible, touchable, and so on.
And of course, modes are not universal, right?
No, they're not universal. They're culturally different. They've changed over time, over history, and so on. They're not set in stone. They're always influenced by the practices in which people use those resources. Absolutely 100% true. I already gave an example, because, the gaze is a resource, it can be used very differently and so on.
For example, the gaze.
I see it as an abstract resource because the gaze can be used, that's why it's in reading images. It can be in a photograph, it can be in a painting, it can be in a sculpture, it can be even in toys. We have toys for young kids that have eyes, They have locomotives with eyes, and they have, cars with eyes. So the gaze is used in many different media. It's a mode. It's become abstract. It's become something that can be realized in different modes. But
interesting.
That's my particular social semiotic take on it.
Okay, so let's move on to talk about your most influential book, Reading Images, the Grammar of Visual Design. We know that the extensions of the term grammar often suggest rules. So what would you like to express by this subtitle, the grammar of visual design, and what are the main points of the book Reading Images? So do you want to grammatize, let's say, the image?
Yeah, I'll answer that. First of all, of course, the use of the word grammar has often been almost like a political move. Many books are called the grammar of, and with saying that's, for example, a mid-19th century book that I've read with much interest called The Grammar of Ornament. People make the grammar of clothes. Anyway, so it is that. But for us, it was one step more. It was at the time that we did this, and that is now more than 30 years ago that we started doing that, to say that it is not the case that the composition, the way that the different parts in the images are arranged, can only be described in a formalistic way. There are actually patterns there that make meaning in the same way that grammatical patterns make meaning in language. So it's an analogy. Now, rules is a very interesting question, because, of course, linguists often say it is describing what people do, but we know better, because we've been to school and we've learned the rules, and the red pencil came in to say this is wrong and this is right, But rules are made by people, Rules they're not inherent in language, and often the way we speak, if you literally, particularly just ordinary conversational speech, if you write literally down, they're not grammatical in that sense at all. They make meaning and use rhythmic phrasing and so on much more than grammar. But we use grammar to make that point. We use the word grammar as a move to make that point. Images also make meaning through the ways that things are related to each other in a group. Now, are they rules or not? Well, they haven't been. How come that there are these patterns? There are, different ways in that happens. But one of them, rather than that there are rules, they are taught everywhere in art and design schools across the world by showing the examples that people have to admire, And then they often say, well, it's really creative, but, you can break the rules. Here are the rules, but you can also break them. This is what you commonly read in the textbooks that people in art schools and so on use. But as you already have said, now many people make images that have never been to art schools, and they've never had these lessons. And then comes in this idea of the role model. And these role models are heavily provided by the mass media and by the internet as well, everywhere for us, for our ways of doing things. And of course, we can vary them, and of course, we can play with them, but they are how the resources are communicated to us, For example, in the early days, I'm now studying at the moment, and I haven't done it yet, family photos. And I see it as a critical discourse project because I think it will show us how the family has changed and how people represent the relations between the members of a family, today and in the past. So I find out already that in the beginning of amateur photography, in the early 20th century, Kodak, had many advertisements in which they showed you how to make family photos. The family, the kids would, the new baby, the two kids would look over into the click, and the father would make a photo. It would be the little yellow box, or the mother would sit with the two kids in the grass for a picnic basket. Father would make it. They showed you that this is family life. This is what you have to put in your albums. And when you look at the actual albums, not identical, but these ideas are picked up. But today there are other models, other kinds. And in the internet, you can actually find drawings and of how to make family photos, where people don't sit up straight with the father in the middle, but have to sort of bend over and be close to each other and show intimacy. And there are models for that as well. And they come across because people have seen these things. And that's how I would like to do it. And then amateur does exactly that. So yeah, I mean, we were studying, also at the moment we're studying the images and the text online shopping sites. And so we studied the clothes shopping site of Zalando. And they had that you could post pictures of yourself there. And people made photographs of themselves that were quite different from selfies and that were more modeled on the full-length format of fashion photos. They would photograph themselves proudly or have themselves photographed proudly in some location, something, as a fashion model, even though they were not a fashion model. So there are role models around to learn the kind of conventions we talk about in reading images.
Interesting. So, Professor, maybe we are running. I hear echo. We are running more than 1 hour. I would like to move on to the practical part, how to read images. And before we move on to the second image, I would like to ask you these direct questions. How can different elements of the image and the written text work together to produce and make meaning? And
okay.
yes, okay. How can we? Yes, I will.
Okay, show the picture. Show the picture. Then I can. Second picture.
Okay,
can you put it up so that people can see it?
Yes, the second picture, because it includes text. It contains some
text and image. Yeah.
Yes. No.
Thank you. Okay. So if you maybe you can make it even bigger. Yeah, but you have to see the whole thing. Okay. So if you look at this picture, no, because now we have to see the bottom of it as well. The bottom, the tins of cat food, we have to see those as well. Maybe you can put the image over the whole screen this time.
Okay. So it's fine?
No, because no. I have to see everything. I have to see the whole picture. Now you've got only part of it.
Okay.
So you have to zoom back out. There you are. Perfect. Okay. So here you have words and image. Now, when you had words with press photographs, such as the one that I just showed you before from the Prague uprising, the text would be just to name what was there. That's one thing photographs can't do. It would have to say, this happened in Prague at a certain day, and these are the Russian soldiers, and so on. That is a particular way of separate words and images. That was already described by Roland Barthes, the French semiotician, back in, now I can't see the image here, back in the early 60s. But in this image, if you can still see it, because I have a black screen.
Okay, I will try. I don't know.
Yes, thank you. Here we see it. Oh no, not again. It goes back to black. There it is. Okay, in this image, it's quite different. The image, the image and the text form are totally imbricated. So what this image really says is this little kitten is spoiled 4 times by 4 different tins of cat food. So it's as though there is the images and the words come together in one sentence, in the equivalent of one sentence, if you translate it. But how? But it is not a sentence. There is not a predicate and so on. But there are things that are very important that make these parts of that message cohere. Because you can see the color of the eyes of the kitten is yellow, and that the tins are also yellow. And you can see that the sheets that the kitten lies on have these flowing lines, and the lines of the font are also flowing and curved. So there is a sort of visual rhyme that brings it all together, and that completely integrates words and pictures in a combined message. And now, if you like, you can also show the next picture.
Okay.
The last picture.
Yes.
So
yes, this
one. This picture is not an advertisement, but it is the title, the name of a Swiss magazine that deals with arts and design. And it is actually made. It was this is ethnographic research. It was hand embroidered by the mother of the designer. So to do that, to make the name of your brand name of your magazine like that, then you say something about craft and tradition and handmade. You contrast, and it is quite different from slick, computer-made, modern kind of titles. So actually, it's not just image and words, even the very visual nature of words that can be part of the message. Words themselves can be multimodal. Words can have shapes, color, and in this case also texture. So you have these whimsical shapes with these little frills. You have the irregularity of the shapes. That it goes on a wavy line. You have the fact that they are 3-dimensional. Words themselves are very often multimodal and have combined different resources, different media in this case, to make a message. In this case, a message about something that this magazine wants to tell you about themselves. Okay, we can go back now to ourselves, and so that's just very brief because we're running out of time. But it would be nice if if we can have maybe just 1 or 2 questions as well.
Yes,
to round it off.
Professor. Yes, in the same vein, Professor, sometimes we encounter different modes of communication, for example, in tourist brochures or political electoral programs and textbooks. How are we going to combine all these discourse and the visual element to make a meaningful whole? We find sometimes a written text besides, let's say, the image, which helps you read and analyze the image. Are we going to borrow the approach of discourse analysis and combine it with grammar or visual design, and then we analyze semiotically the image, or are we going to make a separation?
Now you ask a really important question. I mean,
Yes,
although
practical one.
we've had, that's a practical one, but also a theoretical one. Although there's some good work on traditional image-text relations that apply to cases where image and text are quite separate. Ron Bart used to say you have the linguistic message and you have the visual message, and they're separate. I deliberately showed a picture where they're not separate, just to show that they are not always separate. So it is true that in the history of multimodality, we have developed ways of analyzing different modes separately. What we've tried to do in reading images, and that's one other reason why we use the terminology and make the analysis with Halliday, is that at least you have a terminological framework that allows comparison. So you can say, for example, in the image, the student is actor, but it could be that the newspaper has a caption underneath it that says, yesterday Russian tanks invaded Prague. Then clearly the image tells you a different story from the language. In the image, the student is the actor. In the text, the Russians are the actor. So you can sort of bring the two together. But that's not the whole story. It is still very difficult to, and I've written a new book which will come out early next year. It's called Multimodality and Identity. And in that book, I deal particularly with resources such as color, but also shape and texture, movement, And I am now doing a different move, which we'll have to see whether people can use it or whether it works. But I take as a metaphor not language, but I take as an orchestration of music, a big orchestra, because in something like this packet, example of the embroidered title, all these things work simultaneously. You have color, you have dimensionality. So in an orchestra, all the instruments work simultaneously, but they have nevertheless different roles. So I try to make some new ways of, because it is clear that until now, there was not a good method for doing that with examples of that kind, so that people did not have a systematic way of doing it. They just had to sort of more impressionistically try to describe the overall effect, even though they could be quite precise about each mode separately. So it is a work in progress, and it is not. There is good stuff on image and text, but the whole thing, there is still a long way to go. I have described in introducing social semiotics some of the possibilities, and I do think that visually composition is very important. The layout, the system of layout and composition brings words and things together. So that's one way of doing it. In a time organized message, it's rhythm that brings things together. We have that, but there are still other aspects to explore. So at the moment, we got basically the traditional image-text relations and the possibility of showing how visual composition brings things together and how rhythm. So in my examples in introducing social semiotics, I talk about how in films, you have the action, the dialogue, the sound effects, camera work, music, and my view is that they're brought together by rhythm. Now, you have to look at the concrete examples to see how it works, but that can be done, and that has been done by people. It's quite complex, but that can be done. Same in layout, you can see how words, and how if the placement of things in the image, framing between them, the salience of them can show how the elements of the page, different elements, for example, the words and the images, are brought together.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for this informative and interesting talk. Maybe before we move on to the virtual audience for their questions, I have just maybe another question, because you talked about typography in introducing social semiotics, I think in 2005. It would be interesting to hear a little bit about it. Yes, typography.
Oh, well, you know, typography is, I mean, here, one thing that happened over the years, so we had reading images, and I would give courses on visuality. And then one day I just suddenly realized, you know, I have never talked yet about the visuality of words. I've talked about sound and voice quality and musical sound, but I've never talked about typography. And linguists generally don't do it. So I began to read about it, and I began to teach it in my courses. The students liked it very much. They were very aware how important it is in branding and in, you know, the names of things. Now, if you only walk along the street, you can see such a variety of letter forms are being used to make different meanings, and in particularly, you know, the identity of. So I found that that there was very little to go by. You know, books on typography would have the formal description, you know, of the different parts of letter forms, and you know, the baseline and the cap line and so on. They would have a terminology for the formal things, but they had very little to say. At most, they would talk about the difference between serifs and not serifs, you know. And for the rest, they had a completely different way of talking about typographic differences. And I sort of began to then give a paper at the conference and wrote an article in Information Design Journal to say, look, there are a whole lot of qualities of letter forms that you can look at and that have a meaning potential. You know, for example, they can be very angular or very rounded, and we just saw an example of the word spoiled, spoiled, spoiled. You know, and that is clearly the flowing softness of it, and but also the you know, the reminiscence of calligraphic writing and all, and quality are all things that can be put across by qualities such as angular or curved, bold or light, elongated or squashed, elongated this way or not. Yeah. So I set out a framework for analyzing letter forms that only now is beginning to be used. There's some new stuff coming out of Scandinavia, in particular, in Germany, where people are beginning to use that stuff to analyze typography, and do so, and beginning to do so also quantitatively with large corpuses of. Within the literature for designers, it has not been very common, but we organized with our journal Visual Communication in the around 2005, I think it was, you know, a big conference on typography. And we found that some designers talk about their letter forms in this way, as though they are characters, have certain characteristics, and are talking it differently, but also beginning to have that strong sense of, you know, the meaningful semiotic potential of typography, particularly of letter forms, because typography also includes, of course, spacing between words and between letters and margins, which is more a matter of layout. This, you know, macro typography, as it were.
Yes, Professor, maybe before for the audience, please, if you have any questions, quickly, please write it down here before we conclude this webinar. Professor, I have another question here, please. Could you please state some of the limitations of social semiotics or drawbacks of social semiotics?
Well, that I have in a sense already said, because I think that, that's the reason why you also need two other things. You need ethnography and you need history. And to have the broader social context. Small histories like the history of PowerPoint, big histories like the history of perspective. If you have a text alone, it doesn't tell you who actually made it. You have to go beyond the text to know that, how it's being used. But I analyze, for example, also diagrams. Diagrams can be maybe used in organizations. Charts may be used to tell people how to do their job. Org charts are used to organize who has to be the boss of who. So all these things have to be. The text can, however, the text can always social semiotic analysis of it. Social semiotics includes these things. I see social semiotics as interdisciplinary, but text analysis itself has limitations that we need to recognize. It cannot tell us the whole story. We need to complement it. But you can start with it and then realize it raises questions. For example, the question I mentioned the whole time, how did this come about? How come people make quite similar type of images, even though they haven't learned it in school, and even though nobody's got any explicit rules about it? These questions you can't answer just from the images. You can't. You can guess, but that's only a guess.
Yeah, here is another question, Professor. Someone is asking, how can we interpret multimodality in fiction?
That's very interesting. So that is a subject that has not been studied a lot, but including fiction is becoming. Let's say that we talk about print, and books, not about films, because in films it's very often clear. And just see what there are different modes combining, very clear. In books, traditionally novels, storybooks, on the face of it, there hasn't been a lot of multimodality. But today we get graphic novels, and we get novels that experiment with visual things and with typography and so on, which already started with avant-garde artists of the early 20th century who made concrete poems that had interesting ways of looking. So recently there's been a very interesting book by a Danish scholar called Nina Nøgaard, and it's exactly on how novels these days use multimodality in fiction. But it's becoming more used in stylistics. Of course, in film, narrative fiction, in film, it's already there. There is some very good work going on along those lines in Germany by John Bateman and Chowie Cheng. Well, there is a growing interest in multimodality of the kind that we are talking about, that is based on the social semiotic departure. So it can be done, and I have many film examples, particularly in my book introducing social semiotics. There will be again film examples in my new book, Multimodality and Identity, because there will be a whole chapter on the meaning potential of movement, also in animation.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Maybe this is the last question. What are your future social semiotic projects, or let's say, what projects are you currently working on? We would be curious to know.
I have some research projects together with other people, and one of them is the online shopping project. Yeah, another one is the family photo project that I mentioned. but I also want to write a book about the semiotics of time. This will be semiotic because it will be about time in music, time in film, time in all kinds of time, in maybe even time in dance and movement. I don't know yet. Time as not about way that's been written about, but time as a semiotic phenomenon. Time and language, of course, very important. So that is a book. That's what I want to write next. And now that I am only working part-time in employment, I have a lot of time to get projects done. And I also want to return. We had once a project on toys, and you will see that there are toy examples in my work always, with my Swedish colleague Staffan Zelander. And we've just started to talk about it again because we feel when we had our project, the digital was only in its infancy, and now the children play so much with digital things, and we feel we have to do a sequel to it. So this is a bit longer distance, but we regularly talk about it and we read about it, and we'll probably write about that again as
well. This actually reminds me of what you have said, what you said in an interview with Fredrik Lindstrand in, I think, 2010. Yes, you said as a semiotician, you can't be a specialist. You have to look at the whole semiotic landscape. That is what you admired so much in Roland Barthes.
Correct. Yes. And that's what I've been doing. But of course, you need specialists sometimes. When I wrote my book about color, I was very happy that there were some specialists, like French art historian Michel Pastoureau and John Gage, who had basically spent their whole life studying color, which I didn't. And so I can thank the Lord for these specialists, because without it, you couldn't be that kind of that I am.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, finally we come to the end of this webinar. I would like to thank Professor once again for the informative and interesting talk, and the audience for your interaction. Hopefully this webinar will be beneficial and enjoyable for everybody. Thank you, Professor, for your time and accepting the invitation. Actually, it's like a dream to be here with us. I have read a lot about you and your maybe your colleague Gander Chris. Your work were amazing. Your works were amazing, and I'm also working on social semiotics and critical discourse analysis. I benefited a lot from you, and I still remember when you replied to my emails with guidance and assistance. Okay. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay. Well, all the best with your work, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. And it was a pleasure.
A pleasure. Okay. It's a pleasure. Thank you. Okay. Take care. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Off we go.